Thank you for having me.
Now, to a domestic worker who is hearing this now for the very first time, can you break it down for us what this new minimum wage for domestic workers entail?
I think it's important to firstly explain that domestic workers were not regulated by law up until 1993 when the Basic Conditions of Employment Act was extended to cover them. You may remember that the Basic Conditions of Employment Act is the law that regulates conditions of employment for workers in South Africa. But the problem is that the Basic Conditions of Employment Act does not promulgate minimum wages for domestic workers. Instead, it allows the Minister of Labour to make sectoral determinations for those economic sectors, such as your domestic worker sector, that have employees that are considered vulnerable. These employees are vulnerable in the sense that they may not have trade unions or they may not be sufficiently organized to engage in collective bargaining processes and engage or negotiate minimum wages for themselves. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act allow the minister to set up this sectoral determination for the domestic workers. And according to this sectoral determination, it says that as from 1st of December 2013, the minimum wages for domestic workers that are employed for more than 27 hours per week in the metropolitan areas will be getting R9.63 per hour. And for those ones that are working more than 27 hours per week but are working in the smaller towns or rural areas, they will be getting R8.30. Now, for the workers or domestic workers that work less than 27 hours per week, in the metropolitan areas, they'll be getting R11.27. And then for the ones that are in the smaller towns, they will be getting R9.80.
What is the percentage attributed to this? What are we looking at? 1%, 2%?
Okay, for the metropolitan areas, which are your bigger areas, the annual increase that has been put on the minimum wages is 7.6%, and for the smaller areas, it's 8.6%. So what happens is that when we increase minimum wages, we most of the time we use the inflation rate. But because domestic workers are the low earners, we usually add like 2% or 1% points to the inflation rate. So for area A, which is the bigger areas, we've added 1%, and for area B, which is the smaller areas, we've added 2%.
Some would say that's absolutely nothing, but what about the employers? Did they accept this minimum wage and were they cooperative?
Okay, with employers, I think it's important to explain that when we're doing the minimum wages or when we're promulgating the sector, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act requires us as the Department of Labour to firstly consult with the stakeholders. The stakeholders as in the employers and employees in the sector. So when we do this, we firstly publish a notice in the Government Gazette inviting written representation from the stakeholders, that is the employers and employees. And also we will go around the country in terms of public hearings. That is, we require inputs from employers to say, this is what we think will be the applicable minimum wage, and also the employees to say, this is what we think will be the minimum wage. Now, that consultation process, it's an advantage for us because it allows the members to be involved in the regulation of a sector, and also it helps them to understand the sector and to accept it more and accept the sectoral determination and to comply with the sectoral determination. So I think because of that consultation that we normally do as Department of Labour when we make this sectoral determination, it's easier for us because already employers know that there's a sectoral determination coming and this is what we inputted on the sectoral determination.
Now, in the past, we have seen in many other sectors where lots of workers lost their jobs because of salary or wage increases. How sustainable do you think is this one?
The Basic Conditions of Employment Act requires the Employment Conditions Commission, which is the commission that advises the Minister of Labour on a number of matters, including the making of a sectoral determination or the making of minimum wages. It requires them, when they're advising the minister on the applicable minimum wage, there's a number of factors that they need to look at when they're advising the minister. Firstly, they need to look at whether those recommendations or those minimum wages, are they not going to affect the ability of the employer to conduct business successfully? Secondly, are they not going to affect those smaller employers? Because you may find that the bigger employers can be able to pay the minimum wage, but it doesn't mean that also the small employers will be able to pay the minimum wage. Another thing that they need to look at, that is the Employment Conditions Commission, is whether the likely impact that the minimum wages will have on employment and creation of employment. Because the Minister of Labour and also the Employment Conditions Commission that advises the Minister of Labour do not want a situation whereby there's minimum wages now, but the employers are saying, in that case, they are too high, then let me release this person must just go home. So they look at all those, they try to balance, even though they try to protect the employee in terms of saying this minimum wage should try and improve the cost of living of this employee, or the level of poverty of this employee must be improved. But they also look at the fact that we don't want a situation whereby employers are left to say, we don't want any more people that we are employing. So the Employment Conditions Commission will always look into that when they are coming up with minimum wages, which is the same thing that they did on this increment.
Now, as part of this wage increase, you have cautioned employers that a domestic worker may not made to work more than 45 hours a week. Are these measures in place to make sure, or are there really measures in place to make sure that this doesn't happen? So in actual fact, what I'm trying to ask is, who is going to police it?
Okay, with regards to domestic workers, the sectoral determination clearly stipulates that domestic workers should work a maximum of 45 hours per week. That is 9 hours if a person works for more than 5 days a week, and 8 hours if a person works for more than 5 hours, 5 hours per day. Sorry. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is that any hours that are beyond that the person will be eligible for overtime. And overtime pay is paid at 1.5. Now what happens is that we always indicate that when we're doing advocacy sessions with the domestic workers and the employers, that if a domestic worker does or an employer does not comply with that provision, it's for the domestic worker to go and lodge a complaint at the nearest Department of Labour offices, and then we have got inspectors that make sure that whether it's minimum wages or whatever provision that is provided for in the sectoral determination, they will investigate and enforce that provision. So it's not only for the hours of work, it's also for the minimum wages and any other conditions that are available in the sectoral determination. So our inspectors are there to ensure and enforce that the legislation, employers are complying with the legislation.
How does the domestic worker know if he or she is eligible for this new minimum wage for domestic workers? Is it across the board, and how do you inform them?
Okay. With regards to the increases for the domestic workers, firstly, will apply to all domestic workers in South Africa. But another thing that is important to raise is that we as Department of Labour set the minimum wage, that is the floor of. So it doesn't mean that all the employees or all the domestic workers, even the ones that are getting more than the minimum wage, will be eligible for the increase. It talks to the minimum wage. And what we are going to do as Department of Labour to ensure that people, especially domestic workers, know about this increase in the minimum wage is that we're going to publish the new minimum wages on the newspapers across the country, and also we're going to indicate these minimum wages in the radio stations and also in the billboards around the country.
Thank you so much. That was the Deputy Director, Unathi Ramabulane at the Department of Labour. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
That's your news for now. Still to come. Well, we're going to go to a break right now, and we'll be back.